So our kids gave us a trip for Christmas to Venice, which was pretty amazing. It really does look like this. And for those of you that don't know, Venice is actually part of a group of islands. This is the Adriatic Sea on the east side of Italy, up towards the north, and the early settlers went out into these little tiny islands that you can see here. They were just sandbars, and then they started building on them, and then they started artificially carrying in rocks and making walls and whatever. They built all these. Venice is the most famous, but there's these other islands in here, Murano for glass blowing and whatever. We stayed right here on Lido, and then went across a little ferry to Venice. And so when you go across, there's the Grand Canal that kind of divides Venice in half. I've got part of it showing here. And then right here is St. Mark's Square, St. Mark's Cathedral, the Palace of the Doge. And then think St. Mark's Square, that's a famous place you go. And they took us to see the glass blowing here. You can take an island and go all the way to the island, but you can take a water taxi, and go all the way to the island. But they have a little glass blowing shop right here where they blow the glass. And then they destroy it because legally they can't blow glass on this island. You have to go to Murano. That's interesting. And they took us across right here by the Hard Rock Cafe and saw the ladies that do the lace, the handmade lace. It's pretty amazing. And we did a bunch of other stuff. But anyway, we wound up right here taking a gondola ride. You can do it 25 different places in the city, but it's nice and convenient here next to the square. So we were right here doing the gondola ride. And the reason I'm talking is about that church right there. There's 92 churches, 91 besides St. Mark's, which is the famous one in Venice. And we just happened to be standing outside of this one. And so as we're standing there talking, I asked the guide, so what's the name of this church? And he says, that's the Church of Moses. And I went, really? The Church of Moses? Because there's a scripture that sort of burns my interest on there. So I decided, man, this is something I got to take a look at. So the front of this church was all remodeled in the 16th century, I think they said. There are three famous Italians who got their faces carved onto this, a father and a grandfather and a son, if they paid for the remodeling of the saints and whatever. But actually the inside structure is much, much older. And you find that out when you go inside. First thing you do is you're standing on tombs of saints that are on the floor. The oldest one of these I could find was 1504. And then as I started to look around, there's some really interesting iconography that doesn't seem to match a normal Catholic church. One of which is this, I don't even know what you'd call it. It's a little place where you can stand and speak to the congregation on the side of the church. It's not like a normal one. And it has this really interesting carving of Moses receiving the Ten Commandments, and he's in the full priesthood garb as described in Exodus, complete with the breastplate, with the 12 stones representing the 12 children of Israel. But what caught my attention was the hat. The hat is just outstanding, and I was just transfigured because there's a lot of, if you look up on the internet, there's a ton of different drawings and sketches and whatever. The text is pretty clear, but the visual that it creates of exactly what the vestments of the priesthood look like are often debated. And there's this one phrase that's really weird in Exodus 27, where the Lord is talking about covering the horns of the altar with brass, and then he makes this reference to you also need to cover his horns. And you have to sort of back up several verses to realize he's talking about the garments of the priesthood for Aaron. So this is the first time I'd ever seen it depicted with horns, right? And that mattered for a reason. And that is because I had seen it before. This is an actual picture from the Smithsonian Archives. And where it comes from is the first photographers to the Hopis. The Hopis in northern Arizona have this really interesting two-society priesthood. There's the one-horn and the two-horn priesthood. The one-horn is in charge of temporal matters in this world, and the two horns are in charge of the ceremonies that matter in the next world. It's very interesting, very interesting. And you can find examples of the one horn and the two horn societies in the Smithsonian archives, and you can even see it in some of their cultural stuff like Kachina dolls. Anyway, so I was sort of wandering around in a daze. Like, that's the first time. And then I noticed that this particular church has no Christus. The normal shape of a cross for a church isn't here. It's just kind of one big rectangle. And at the end, they don't have a Christus. They have this big 35-foot tall statue of Moses receiving the Ten Commandments from God. And then his brother Aaron is down here on one side and Miriam's on the other with some other iconography. And if you look carefully at Aaron, he's dressed also in the garments of the priesthood with the chest plate and the sash and everything. But as you noticed by now, he also has the very distinctive hat. This is two different places in that one chapel where there's just no way of getting around it, right? It's like, okay, this was intentional. And so I was like, wow, man, all right, that's totally cool. And you say, why does that matter? Well, there's this thing called the diaspora. And basically what that means is when Jerusalem was destroyed, it was actually destroyed in two pieces. First, the northern kingdom was wiped out and carried away captive by the Babylonians and dispersed north of Jerusalem. And then in 600 BC, the southern kingdom was the Jews and the Benjaminites were also defeated. And so you have this period of from about 700 BC to time of Christ, really, where the Jews are being dispersed throughout the Mediterranean, and we have some evidence up into Europe. And so, I'm right here. I'm in the corner of this boot, and I have evidence here of some sort of Israeli activities. And one of the other tombs on the floor, they hadn't actually given a Roman date, but they had told you who they were. And so I was just kind of wandering around going, holy freak. And I was kind of in a daze, really. And for those of you that aren't quite sure why this matters, I had heard of the Etruscans before. And you say, Etruscans, what are you talking about? Well, it doesn't take very long to Google and find out who settled Italy. And you find out that northern Italy and down along the coast was settled by the Etruscans, and particularly Venice, right about 550 BC, so 50 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. This group of people wanders into Venice and starts building this fortified city in the middle of the lagoon, and you can read down through the Etruscans. You can find some really interesting stuff, like the guy on the floor who was buried in the church was telling you exactly who he is. Anyway, and where I'd run into the Etruscans before was 20-something years ago on the cover of a magazine. They had an article about Moses, but the Ten Commandments were not carved on the stone in Hebrew. It was carved in Etruscan, and that's where I first started being interested in Etruscan. In fact, for those of you that are LDS, if you go to your church, what's it called? Library. You go to your church library, and there's this famous picture of Moses with the Ten Commandments. But if you zoom in on it, you'll notice that it's not carved in Hebrew; it's carved in Etruscan. And that all stems from this, destruction of Babylon. When they were destroying Babylon, was destroying Jerusalem, they had to. All these people exited. The ones that weren't carried away captive were dispersed, as I said, around the Mediterranean. So the reason that matters is there are other linguistic examples of this. For example, this is a map of the linguistic layout of Germany, and High German, the old High German, is very concentrated down in Switzerland, really, and by Zermatt, and that plays right into, this is Zermatt, the kingdom of Zermatt, and in fact, it was called Alemannia originally in Italian and Spanish, referring to the language they spoke. That translates to Germany in modern times, so it actually was a reference to the language they spoke right there. And it fits right into that whole idea of the diaspora coming out of Jerusalem, up along the Mediterranean, along the coast, and in this area. So I'm wandering around Venice, kind of in this daze of, you know, wow, what have I just seen? Apparently, that used to be, before it was remodeled by those people to be a Christian church, it was some sort of, I hesitate to use the word synagogue, but it was obviously not a Christian church. It had a different purpose. And so as we're wandering around Venice, this was down in this part, and Lonnie wanted to go all the way around to the top of the Grand Canal and get on the boat. Rick Steves, the tour guide, said if you get on there, you get to pick the front of the boat. Nobody else is on yet. And then they stop. They swing back and forth at all these little ports, and they go all the way down. And it was about sunset. It was beautiful. So as we were doing that, on like the third stop, I had this impression we needed to get off. And I'm like, why? And I blew it off. And then we went on to the other side. And then we came back, and we were right here at this old church. And I was like, man, I just felt like we got to get off. So I'm telling my wife, we got to get off. And she's like, have you lost your mind? I don't want to give up my seat. And I'm like, please, we got to get off. So as it turns out, we got off in the ghetto. It's actually known as the ghetto, where the Jews have lived for hundreds of years, 500-600 years. As it turns out, this church is actually not open to the public, but we wound up going to a church that was, that I could also see from the bank, just 2 blocks from there, which was really cool. Side note, it's called the Church of San Germina. She's the patron saint of people who, eyes, people that need to see. Anyway, there's this amazing clock in there. It's from the 1500s. You can still see the hammer strokes of the blacksmith in the gears, but this sucker still runs, weights on it and everything. So that was really cool. I was excited to find that. I had seen a YouTube video on it 15 years ago or whatever, and that was really cool. But as I wandered around, I couldn't find anything like, why was I here? The few paintings they did have showed a papal hat, but, and it is split a little, but as opposed to the one they wear now. But nothing really impressive until just before you leave. There's a really old painting, and you can see that the guy has the right kind of hat. And so now I've got 3 examples from the 1500s that whoever was alive then knew that this was the right kind of hat to be wearing. And so I was just rock star. Now there's more to this, but this is just part 1. But I just want to record what got me so excited about Venice. This was totally cool.